for inviting me as well. We're going to rush through this next panel. We are going to be very, very quick. I've already asked our panelists to speak for 5 to 7 minutes and take questions at the very end of the panel. So we'll do that. Brief introductions, alphabetically. Ahije, Evelyn Ahije, University of Surrey, doctoral degree. I should be calling her Dr. Evelyn. Civil-based asset forfeiture regime. US has one, so I'm anxious to hear what she has to say. Non-practicing solicitor in England and Wales. Again, very impressive panel. Ms. Wambui Karaoke, Catholic University of Eastern Africa, Diploma of Public Management, University of Chile, teaches at the Strathmore Law School, teaching fellow, written on urban transport choice. Dr. Joyce Malala, lecturer at Ascot University Law School, especially interested in regulation and supervision. I believe her first book on mobile regulation is just coming out, first of its kind, subject which I find particularly interesting. Sandra Mututi, Masters of Applied Philosophy from Strathmore University, Nairobi, teaching philosophy and ethics at Strathmore. And I'm missing one person. We have a latecomer, and I apologize, but somehow, wait a minute, I have it here. No, I don't have it. I apologize because we had a late addition. I'm going to ask Joy and her co-panelists to go first because I know she has some other obligations. Joy?
Hello, everyone. I think Wambui will begin for 5 minutes. Just to give a caveat, this is a working paper, a research we intend to carry out. So we are still in the workshop stage, but we thought it would fit into this theme of financial crime and African perspective, looking at the transport industry. Take it away, Wambui.
All right, thank you very much, Ross. Thank you, Joy. I hope I can be heard. I'm seeming to have a bit of a problem with my internet, but if anything goes wrong, please let me know and I can turn off my video. So we can just move to the first slide. Here we are. So just giving a perspective or a background of how transport happens in Nairobi. You can see here we have a modal split where a majority of the people in Nairobi and the larger Kenya use buses and minivans, which we call matatus, to commute and to move around. So by research taken by Deloitte in 2019, showed that 46% of us use public means for commuting around the city, for work trips and other trips as well. A lot of the countries in this area are characterized by what we call informal transport, which has a lot of mid-sized vehicles running on semi-flexible routes and not very fixed schedules or stops and very little public support. They usually operate purely for business and on a small scale with private ownerships of these vehicles. And this is what is also very common in a lot of the developing countries, including Kenya itself, right? The second mode that is very commonly used is walking, which is 39%. And this is common with people of the lower income bracket as well as the middle class. And 13% have their own car ownership. We can move to the next slide, please. Right, so in terms of the scenery of the transport within the city, we do have 46%, which is, as I have mentioned earlier, and which is informal and forms up to 50% of transport on major corridors. They're very competitive in nature as they are privately owned and for profit. We can move to the next slide. As I've said previously, the minivans that we use mostly are called matatus. And just to introduce a lot of stakeholders within this industry, we can see a few images we have here from the Naipolitans, which does a lot of work in urban transport within Nairobi and within the larger Kenya. And here we can see that there are a lot of players in this particular sector, including drivers, conductors, casual drivers and conductors, people who move the passengers into the vehicles. We have also touts, stage clerks, vendors, ladies who sell lunch and other meals to the Matatu crew, and also the mechanics and all these other people who form the whole ecosystem. And interesting to note is that this whole ecosystem, as the Matatu industry started off in 1973, which was now serving the African population and creating transport for that segment of the society at that point in time, which was illegal at that point. So prior to 1973, they operated illegally as a need for transport for the Africans, the natives during the colonial period. And the word matatu comes from the word 30 cents, which was this flat standard fee that was used at that particular time, which has since increased. And it was quite a monopoly in its time. It is characterized with high corruption among the crew, the Matatu crew, as well as the police in this sphere. So it is characterized as massive corruption, poor quality equipment, and impracticability. Around 2010, they had tried to streamline the sector by creating sort of an organizing system where they were all required to be in savings and credit cooperatives, called SACCOs, which had modeled around intercity matatus, moving from one county to another. And this, in a bid to regulate the industry, they created a system which most matatus were required to be operating under SACCOs, just to create a lot more order in the system. And prior to that, they were required to get a transport license from the Transport Licensing Board, which was separate. And as time went along, it created a National Transport and Safety Authority by an Act of Parliament in October 2012. And this entity was mandated to sort of streamline the whole process of the matatu sector, the public transport. And this created a bit of order in the space. The next slide, please. So in terms of the corruption and financial crime that occurs in the transport sector, we have state actors as well as non-state actors. And in the state actors, a report by Transparency International showed that the highest or the most corrupt state entity are the Kenya Police in terms of corruption and bribery. And 60 to 93% of the respondents said they were likely to give bribes to the police officers. And you can see there that we have the highest percentage, which is 22%, going or attributed to the police. In the same breath, we have also that matatus should ideally go through inspection, but a lot of times during this inspection, which is done by also state actors, they are able to give bribes, and as much as the vehicle is not roadworthy, they will still be allowed to be on the road, and they are able to operate. At any one point, due to this oversight by the regulators, a police officer can stop a matatu and find anything, and will definitely find something wrong with the vehicle and a justification to have a bribe. And a lot of the crew prefer not to engage or not to move forward and have it in a judicial process. They would rather just pay the police officer to move forward. And the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, in their quarterly report of 2018, found that numerous of the cases that they were looking at of grand corruption had to do with a lot of police officers who were taking bribes from matatu crew and also personal vehicles, as well as long distance trucks, right? That didn't need to, that would avoid paying or avoid any inspection so that they can proceed with their journeys. In the Business Today 2019, during a meeting by the Matatu Owners Association, they claimed that they were losing Kenya shillings 900 million a month to corruption, which is quite a big amount. And this money was being paid to cartels, criminal gangs, transport actors, rogue traffic officers, dishonest National Transport Authority officers, and crafty county officials, including the county governments within the cities. And also in 2002, there was a report that said that 40% of the matatus on the road were owned by the police and also other state actors, including politicians. We can move to the next slide. So a summary of the state actors in this space include the officers, the judicial officers, the Kenya Police, regulators such as the National Transport Safety Authority, employees, and public officers such as politicians and other actors in that space. So here you can see, despite the efforts by the judiciary aimed at discouraging corruption in traffic matters, most participants, that is 80% of long distance drivers, 86% of matatu drivers, 86% of bodas, which are the motorcycles within the cities used for public transport, and 89% of taxi drivers indicated that they preferred to resolve matters outside the court due to collision at the courts. We can move to the next slide. In terms of non-state actors in this include such vigilante groups such as the Mungiki, which is a youth-led vigilante group that had grown in notoriety for a lot of violent crimes that were happening, especially prior to 2010. And in 2007, there was a shoot to kill order by the then Minister for Security, which led to a decline in their presence, and they were the ones who were controlling a lot of the routes. So in terms of access to routes, a lot of these cartels would demand for payment, and they would have to pay 200 shillings or thereabouts of $2 every morning and every evening to be allowed to gain access to the route or to operate every day. So this is a lot of lost revenue that was going to fund these violent groups. And now since there was the shoot to kill order and there was a reduction in the presence of the Mungiki, there is also another neighborhood group called the Kamjesh, which is also an informal gathering or an informal organization of a youth who collect also money to be able to allow the matatus to operate within these routes. So these route cartels also charge for operation within the routes. And in a paper that I cite heavily, by Ference of 2021, the payouts to the police and gangs vary depending on the route, but can cost up to $8 or more a day. And refusal to pay can come with dire consequences, including burning the vehicles, death of the matatu operators, and other severe consequences. The next slide, please. In terms of regulating the sector to control or to ensure that funding is not lost or revenue that should be collected, such as taxes and payments for other services, such as inspection and fines that are collected. The National Transport and Safety Authority has tried to harmonize a lot of processes that were previously held in sort of silos in different departments. For getting the driver's license, getting the license for the vehicle was formerly with the Kenya Revenue Authority. The police would also do the inspections for vehicles. And so this has been all consolidated under the National Transport Security and Safety Agency. However, there are still a few loopholes within the system where officials request for bribes to be able to process a lot of these systems that are required, or they would request for a bribe to overlook a lot of flaws that are found in the vehicle or even in terms of licensing. So previously the fragmented services and the manual processes created loopholes, and there was a thriving underworld of cartels that would create a lot of illicit financial flows. However, as the matatu ecosystem is very fast, as I have explained in the previous slide, it requires, or the crew generally requires, to have a very financial system, hence a lot of hesitance in terms of moving towards a cashless system, which would be able to identify the exact revenue that is being collected. So there has been a lot of attempts to try and make this whole system, the payment system, cashless, but there's a lot of resistance from both sides, from the police and also from the crew.
Wambui, I apologize, but we are getting on in time. Could I ask you to get to your conclusions, please?
All right, thank you, Ross. Next slide. Right. So in terms of how the transport sector is organized in terms of the legal framework, we have the Constitution of Kenya, the Public Officers Ethics Act, the Kenya Bribery Act, which Joy will take over to discuss, the Anti-Corruption and Economic Crimes, the National Police Service Act that requires how the police should carry themselves, the National Police Service Commission Act, the Kenya Traffic Act, the Transport Licensing Act, and the National Transport and Safety Authority Act. So in conclusion, there is quite a bit of money that is lost to corruption, and essentially which affects a lot of the local Kenyans, the everyday users. And as we have seen, a lot of these transport modes are used by people who are of lower income brackets. And if a lot of the inspection is not done well, a lot of the licensing is not done well, it leads to a situation where we have a lot of unroadworthy vehicles on the road and accidents. And at a higher scale, in terms of regulating the whole area, the transport network, we have the situation where we have kickbacks being given within the line ministries in terms of the construction of the road, which eliminates a lot of necessary provisions such as cycling and walkways for pedestrians and cyclists. All right, and that's my conclusion. I'll hand over to Joy right now. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for still being engaged this late in the day. We really appreciate it. So I'm going to take you briefly, very briefly, in an elevator pitch style presentation, because a lot of what I'm going to talk about has been reinforced and reinstated and reaffirmed by many of the speakers already. But as I said, this is a working paper and a research that we're trying to put together about how we've been talking a lot about legal transplants and adapting international standards that are not fit for purpose and do not sort of embolden the nuances that global South countries have. And we wanted to look at the transport industry because it represents the intersection of the citizen and the institution. So we are sort of trying to address the institutionality of applying the law, that we have a set of rules that are instituted, and then we expect society to comply, but there's a misstep when the people who are tasked to enforce the law are the rule breakers. So in this sense, we're talking about how the police extort from the citizens, and it basically, we're looking at grassroots bribery. So the next slide, please. The next one. So this is the context, that at the point at which citizens encounter bribery is through state actors or people who are instituted to enforce the law, such as the police. They extort motorists on various occasions, either flouting traffic offenses or non-compliance of rules, or basically the whole gambit of extortion and bribery. So what happens is there's a fear of the court process, which is a catalyst to the upsurge in graft cases. And because the court process takes a very long time, then we are then forced to bribe our police officers. Next slide. So what governs bribery in Kenya is the Bribery Act, which was enforced in 2016. The act defines what bribery is, but there is no, the universal sort of definition is accepting payment for favor, right? But how we understand it is accepting payment and giving payment for convenience. It's the price we pay for convenience. So that's what basically bribery is defined. But this act was modeled under the UK Act, almost word for word, without the nuances of culture and context. So the other regulatory framework is the Anti-Corruption and Economic Crimes Act and the Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission, and the other legislative instruments that Wambui has previously mentioned. Next slide, please. So the implementation challenges are brought about by, again, as I said, the legal transplantation, and a way for us to sort of model policies that account for our own circumstances. Because if I was to explain to you how the matatu industry works or the transport industry works, it would be very difficult to model the transport policy from the UK into the Kenyan system in order to tackle bribery, because it just would not work. So that's part of the implementation challenge. There's also a lack of nuanced approach to cultural underpinnings and a sort of imposition of Orientalism standards that we look at our situations and model them to other situations that do not necessarily apply. Next slide, please. The possible solutions we are hoping to find or to model are not just law approach, because we are seeing that regulations are not enforced, they're not implemented, they're not followed, they're not safeguarded, they're not upheld. We're looking at a citizen-centered approach to bribery, because it is bribery is about individual exchanges, and it's an undercurrent and it's a language of oppression, because the police occupy a position of power, and the people who use matatus or the transport industry in Kenya are people from unequal backgrounds. So we are also proposing privatization of accredited checkpoints on roads, which is a point at which bribery occurs. We're also proposing standardization of levies and perhaps looking at shortcut probation times, because that's an additional pain point. Next. And I think Sandra will take us through the ethics behind corruption, which we're trying to use as a solution to these problems. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Joy. So the next slide, please. And the next slide, please. So I'll just begin from picking up from what Joy talked about. Is it possible for us to look at a citizen-based approach? And I looked at three broad philosophers who give motivations as to why we can be moral and why the citizen can actually implement what we need to have a moral or an uncorrupt world. So for Aristotle, he talks about looking for eudaimonia, which is happiness. And happiness can be found by living a good life, which is a virtuous life. So there's motivation for the citizen, for the person, for the individual to actually live a good life, because to live a virtuous life because it leads to a good life. Then we have Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, who spoke about the social contract, that in return for us giving up part of our freedoms, the society serves us. So it only makes sense that if we want to receive good from society, we also do good within the society for us to have a cohesive society. So there is motivation again for us to be moral, for us to have good behavior, because we have sort of signed the social contract. Then we have Kant, and Kant is very black and white. He speaks about duty as the right thing to do. So he speaks about duty or doing the right thing or being moral because it is what you are meant to do, not because of anything else. And so these three, who are very have very different perspectives, do all point to the fact it is possible for us as citizens, and in Kenya specifically, to have good behavior. So what makes us unable to have good behavior? So next slide, please. So when you look at corruption in the African context, what we find is that we as citizens, and I'm speaking about the transport industry in particular, we come to rely on connections and favors as opposed to the formal political, social, and economic rules. That corruption and the inefficiencies created by corruption create that inevitable facet of life. So the more the public sector becomes dysfunctional, then the more we rely on corruption as a way of life. And you would think that it would dissuade us from being corrupt, but you find like even in the transport industry, as a citizen who, for example, drives a car, when you have broken a law, it is easier to bribe a policeman than it is for you to go to court. But why is that? Why is that true? And we know that we abhor corruption as an immoral thing. Why then does it become our first step when we want to get out of bad things? So next slide, please. Yeah, so we find, first of all, and I think Joy and Wambui have both spoken about this, that we do have a lot of anti-corruption reforms. Yeah, we have strong legal reforms. We have a lot of good framework. But the problem is translating these laws into practice. Yeah, so it seems sometimes that these anti-corruption reforms not only fail to prevent corrupt activities, but sometimes they even create new opportunities or new incentives or new innovative ways for being corrupt. Yeah. So the next slide. So I won't go through this because both Joy and Wambui spoke about them, but this is just to highlight the fact that yes, there is something that is being done legally. We do have legal framework. We see the problem and we're trying to act on it. Yeah. So next slide. And so why isn't this acting? Why isn't this legislature working? So in as much as we, the citizens, abhor corruption, we are unlikely to monitor and act against corruption because many of these anti-corruption reforms require us, the citizens, to enforce the laws. So it's what other speakers have spoken about, the fact that we need to whistleblow. We need to be the ones to report anti-corruption things. But why are we unlikely to report them? The first thing is that we are unlikely because it is risky in terms of a whistleblower is not sure of their safety in Kenya. A whistleblower doesn't know if what they go and whistleblow will actually be changed, will actually be taken anywhere, because the people we're reporting to are the same ones who are supposed to implement the legislature. Yeah, and the second thing is that there's low trust to everybody that as I, the citizen, are meant to go out and enforce these legislation by whistleblowing, for example, there's really short-term gains that I know, and we see it many times in Kenya when we find that somebody has been caught in a very corrupt way. We know it's only a short time before they're released. Yes, so we don't see the follow through. What happens after that? Yes, this big person or this police officer was caught taking a bribe, but they're out on the streets the next day. So there's no motivation for us to actually go and report corruption. So next slide, please. Yeah, so we find perhaps the problem, and I think this was spoken about by Dr. Dikonya and Professor Shehu, that we are trying to implement a one-size-fits-all, that while corruption is generic, it's everywhere in the world, there isn't a generic solution. There are differences in cultural beliefs and value system and norms. So what is appropriate in one society or in one country is inappropriate in another country. So anti-corruption and compliance effects, they usually use a factor approach, which relies on a checklist of actions or components that need to be included. So this generic nature ignores the contextual difference where this legislature is being put in place. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Apologies, Sandra, but I'm the bad guy of this conference.
I have just one last slide and I'm done, I promise.
I am truly grateful. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ross. Yes. The last slide, yeah. So the anti-corruption program, yes, we need to take into account the factors, like we're being sensitive to differences in local circumstances, that how corruption in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, is tackled is different to how corruption in different parts of Asia or Eastern Europe, which is far more systematic, is encountered. So if an anti-corruption program does not take these differences into account, we'll find that success at best will be limited. So thank you, Ross. I'm done. This is the last slide, and thank you everyone for your time.
Thank you, Sandra. The person that I neglected to introduce, and I apologize to him, is Chinedum Akpala. Dr. Akpala is a lecturer at Nottingham Trent, recently left University of Law at Birmingham, research interests in money laundering, prosecutorial discretion, legal ethics, corruption, etc. So I do apologize, Chinedum, for that oversight. Who's next? Chinedum, great. I don't know how my picture got there. Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're coming in and out. Can you, I'm not sure what to suggest.
Perhaps we could move on to the next speaker while we, perhaps if you're able to log out and log back in, if it's a connection problem.
Okay, just please see me and see my slides.
Yes, we can see you now and hear you well.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, can you also see me?
So sorry, Chinedum, the line is very sketchy. So can I suggest that perhaps you log out of Zoom, log back in again, and we'll just use that time and
Can
move
you
to
see
the
the
next speaker. It might be a connection issue.
Can you see the presentation?
We can see the presentation, but the line is not very clear.
Hello, everyone. Can you see the presentation?
We can see the presentation. The line is not very clear.
We can't hear you, Chinedum.
Oh my God, the network is. Can you see, please? Can you see the presentation? Do I turn off the cameras?
Yes, perhaps if you turn off your video, but we can see the presentation. So if you turn off your video, that might also help.